In 1997, a family in San Antonio, Texas, got the phone call every parent of a missing child prays for. Their missing son had been found. He was alive and in Spain. There were tears and hugs at the airport, and there was a boy standing in a doorway he hadn't stood in for 3 years. The only problem is that he wasn't their son. In fact, he wasn't even American. His real name was Frederick Bourdin. He was 23 years old and a serial con artist from France, and he was about to move into this family's house and live there as their missing child for almost 5 months. Hi, and welcome back to the channel. Here, I share scareful stories. Stories to make you think, make you wonder, make you a little scared sometimes, and maybe, just maybe, make you a little more careful. If you like what you see here today, give the video a like. I'd love it if you would subscribe to the channel, and even more so, if you would leave a comment down below. So here's what we're going to be spending the next 20-ish minutes on. How do you convince a mother, a sister, an FBI agent, and an entire school system that you are someone you have never even met? And once you're sleeping in his bed and eating at his table, how do you keep it up week after week with brown eyes staring back at people who remember their blue-eyed brother or son? That's the story of Frederick Bourdin, the man the press would later nickname the Chameleon. But we're not starting with him, not just yet. We're starting with the boy whose life he stepped into, because Nicholas Barclay's story doesn't end with an arrest. And in a lot of ways, that's where it might even actually start. Nicholas Barclay was 13 in June of 1994. He had blue eyes, light brown hair, and a chipped tooth. He had homemade tattoos on his hand, which he'd given himself with a sewing needle. He wasn't an easy kid, and nobody pretends otherwise. He'd already had run-ins with the law, and in fact, he had a court date coming up that could have sent him into a juvenile facility. On June 13th, he was playing basketball with a couple of friends at the park. He called his house for a ride home. His brother Jason picked up and told him that their mom was asleep after a night shift, and he said he'd have to walk. But Nicholas never made it home. And here's the detail that bothers people. Because of that court date, the family didn't panic right away. Kids who are scared of what's coming sometimes disappear on purpose for a day, maybe a week, and this wasn't the first time that Nicholas had left, but only for a day. But this time, Nicholas didn't come back. He didn't come back that week or that year, and then the case went cold. The flyers came down, and after 3 years, most people who'd known Nicholas Barclay had made peace with never finding out what happened to him. But then, in the fall of 1997, a shelter worker in Spain called San Antonio with news nobody expected. A frightened, withdrawn young man had turned up outside a phone booth near a train station in southern Spain. He wouldn't give his name, and he seemed terrified of being fingerprinted. Somehow, though, through a process that we'll come back to in a minute, that changed. Officials worked the case through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Files got pulled and photos got compared. One matched Nicholas Barclay. Carrie, Nicholas's older sister, flew to Spain to bring her brother home. She sat across from a face 3 years older, a little bit rougher, and altered by whatever he claimed to have survived. And she said, yes, that's my brother. So hold on to that. There was a grown woman looking directly at the face of the man who'd taken her brother's identity and recognized him as family. And we're going to come back to that more than once because it's one of the strangest parts of this entire case. He was flown to Texas, and there was a huge welcome home celebration, replete with TV cameras. And in the middle of it, a French car thief and habitual imposter, absolutely certain he had no idea how far this was going to go. Here's the thing. I think you can imagine that very little about this, almost nothing about this held up. The eyes were wrong, the accent was wrong, the age was wrong by nearly a decade, and somehow none of that stopped him. and not the family even, and not the consular officials in Spain, and not at first the FBI. Bourdin had originally just wanted an identity that would get him out of being fingerprinted, as his own fingerprints would have exposed a long rap sheet. So when Spanish police found him, he wouldn't give up his name, and he played mute and traumatized, which caused the police to send him to a youth shelter. But he was just buying time. Once he was safely tucked inside the shelter, he made a call. Posing as a shelter official, he called an American Missing Children hotline and gave a physical description: age, build, and general look. He gave his description. The hotline ran it, and they came back with a name, the possibility of him being Nicholas Barclay, and then they faxed over a photo. One look at the photo, and something clicked. 3 years is a long time and would allow for a kid's face to change. A little doubt, Bourdin figured, was all he needed, so he got to work turning himself into a ghost. He dyed his hair closer to Nicholas's shade. He added blue contacts over his brown eyes. He talked another young detainee into tattooing his hand with markings close to Nicholas's self-made ink, and he practiced an American accent. And for the parts that couldn't be faked, like the accent that would never fully disappear and the eyes that were the wrong color even under the contacts, he built a story almost too disturbing to question. He said he'd been kidnapped and forced into a child trafficking ring run out of Europe, and that his captors had altered his eye color to keep him from being identified. And I don't know, can you even do that? Can you change your eye color? That just seems like something that the FBI would certainly understand. But his story was doing two jobs at once. It explained away the physical inconsistencies in his body, and anyone who questioned him would be somebody who is re-traumatizing a trafficking survivor. And that's the whole con right there in summary. So remember it. It's going to come up again and again. And one of the things that I always think about with this story is, did they have the same height? There's certain things that you just can't change. Eye color would be one. Later we'll talk about ears, but height is one. If you've ever seen that movie Face Off with John Travolta and Nicolas Cage, you'll realize what I'm talking about. I just could never, I know some people like that movie. I just got so lost in the fact that these two dudes look so different. It wouldn't matter if you take one person's face off and switch it with the other. Nobody would ever believe that these are the same people. That's just crazy. And that it happened in real life is even crazier. Not that they took their faces off, but you know what I mean. People faking being other people. It's kind of nuts. Bourdin moved in with Nicholas's mother, Beverly, and lived with her as her son for close to 5 months. He had the wrong accent, and she might have thought, well, maybe that's just the trauma. Maybe 2 years in Europe does that to a voice, kind of like how people go on vacation and end up taking on the accent of where they are. But he had the wrong eyes, even with contacts in. Did she think, well, that's weird? But he said they'd been altered, so how do you even question that? The wrong ears, which is a detail almost nobody thinks to check. People's ears don't change a lot from the time they're born. I mean, obviously your head gets bigger in that, but the shape of your ears is very unique. It's almost like a fingerprint. So his mom and his family might have thought, well, he's grown a few years, but he also looked like a grown man and not a 16-year-old. But given the trauma he said he'd been through, maybe the trauma aged him. But there's more. He also didn't recognize old classmates, and he couldn't remember basic details about his own childhood. So that would make you pause. But each one alone seems explainable in that trauma does strange things to people. Kids look different after puberty. People forget names and other things under stress. But when you stack all of it up, the eyes, the ears, the accent, the age, the memory, at some point you're not looking at a traumatized teenager anymore. You're looking at a grown stranger. Nancy Fisher, the FBI agent on the case, had doubts almost from day one. But there was already a problem. The family had identified him. Officials had already issued him a passport, and on paper, the case was closed. Nicholas Barclay had been found. Cameras were rolling, and a grieving family had just gotten their miracle. Walking that back meant admitting that the system had gotten it catastrophically wrong, and in public and to the family's face, the FBI would have had to have said, "This child that you're saying is your child is not your child." Once enough people had already said yes, saying no gets harder every single day after that, even with the evidence sitting right there in front of you. It's easy to say grief and move on, but the grief was real here. This was already a house shaped by addiction and instability, with Beverly's own struggles and repeated police visits over the years. And the idea of getting her youngest son back after 3 years was almost too good to question. But grief alone doesn't explain an FBI agent, a Spanish court, and a U.S. passport office all missing the same red flags. For that, you need a few more ingredients. Let's start with confirmation bias. Once Carrie identified him in Spain on camera in front of officials as her brother, everyone downstream had a strong reason to look for evidence that confirmed that she was right and to explain away anything that didn't fit. Then there's authority bias. By the time Bourdin reached Texas, Spanish police, U.S. consular staff, and a federal passport office had already treated him as Nicholas. Each new person meeting him wasn't evaluating a stranger's claim from scratch. They were inheriting a decision made by people with badges and letterhead. And then you have the sunken fallacy. Carrie had already told the world on television, "This is my brother." Walking that back wasn't just admitting a mistake. It was admitting that she hadn't recognized her own brother's face, a much harder thing to say out loud than simply pushing forward. And then there's the trap Bourdin had built on purpose. The trafficking story didn't just explain his appearance, it made questioning him feel cruel. Every red flag came pre-wrapped in a reason not to ask more about it. So when Nancy Fisher had a young man flown out for a specialist evaluation and came back convinced that there was no chance he was an American, let alone Nicholas Barclay, and told Beverly exactly that, well, you can guess what happened. Beverly didn't hesitate. "How dare you say he's not my son?" And that's not a woman who's rationally weighing evidence. That's a mom who had already decided what she wanted to be true and dared anyone to say otherwise. So was that grief, denial, or something else entirely? We're not exactly sure. I tend to think that denial is one of the strongest human drives, is that when we really want to believe something, we will deny all else to make sure that we see that as right. And you can see this. There's another story, Alexis Patterson, who is a child who is missing from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And many years later, a woman claims to be Alexis, and her husband thinks she's Alexis. And Alexis's mom says, well, even though she's been proven not to be, I'll accept her as my daughter. Is that just moms of missing children so desperate to have their children back that they'll accept just anyone as their child? It's just really sad. Now that Bourdin was fully inside this family's life, sleeping in the missing boy's room, it's worth asking the question that the internet has been asking for 20 years. What kind of person does this? Frederic Bourdin was born in 1974 outside of Paris. He never knew his father, and he was raised largely by his grandparents. And by his own account, it wasn't a home built on affection. He ran away as a teenager. And somewhere along the way, he discovered that he was very, very good at becoming other people. Long before Texas, Bourdin was already impersonating orphans across Europe, hunting for what he once called the perfect home, which just sounds really sad. If that's genuine and he was really just looking for a loving home to live in, how sad is that he didn't have his own home like that? In one case, in the early 90s, he showed up at a train station pretending to be mute and homeless. Doctors and social workers, completely taken in, sent him to a children's hospital. He kept the act going for weeks until suspicion caught up with him the same way it always eventually does. And this wasn't a one-time impulse. Bourdin claims to have used something like 500 false identities over his lifetime. 3 of them, 3, were of real missing teenagers. And here's the detail that tells you exactly how confident this man was. Years after Nicholas Barclay, at 31 years old, when he was balding and was using cream to get his facial hair to disappear, and he was wearing a baseball cap to hide his hairline, Bourdin enrolled in a French junior high school as a 15-year-old orphan. He made friends and he sat through classes for an entire month. Actual teenagers had no idea that the guy next to them in homeroom was old enough to be some of their fathers. He only got caught because the school administrator happened to see a television program about him. That may be a broken, pitiful liar stumbling through life, but it's also a man who could look a room full of teachers and children in the eye and make himself invisible in plain sight. Psychologists who evaluated him weren't optimistic that he could ever stop. One assessment put it bluntly: they didn't think it was possible to change those personality traits. Bourdin himself has said more than once that what he was actually chasing wasn't money. It was being taken in and fed and housed and wanted. And missing children offered him something no other identity could: a family that was already desperate and already primed and already praying for the exact phone call that he was about to make come true. And that's fraud, but it's also a wound a family can't say no to, and climbing straight inside it, which is just, it's just sad on all levels. By late 1997, a documentary crew had started following the Barkley family's miracle reunion. A private investigator named Charlie Parker got pulled onto the project almost by accident. He was hired to help the crew and not to reopen a case that everyone considered solved. Parker sat down across from the young man, calling himself Nicholas Barclay, and something felt wrong immediately. There was an old photo of the real Nicholas nearby, blue-gray eyes staring back. It didn't gel. As Parker would later put it, something was off, and he knew it before he could even explain why. So he did what investigators do. He looked at the ears. Ears, as it turns out, are almost as reliable as fingerprints. The shape barely shifts with age, and they're brutally hard to fake. Parker held up old photos of Nicholas's ears next to the young man sitting in his mother's living room, and they didn't match, not even close. Parker took it to the FBI and got exactly the reception you'd expect from an outsider trying to unravel a case that the Bureau had already closed. He got pushback, accusations of overstepping, and a warning about obstructing an active federal investigation. So picture that for a second. A grown man is standing in a room full of federal agents insisting, "Hey guys, just look at the ears. You'll see that this isn't the same kid." And everyone with the badge was more certain about a story than he was about two photographs held side by side. He kept saying it anyway, though, to the FBI and to anyone else who would listen. Look at the ears. He became, in a sense, the one person in the whole story doing what the audience at home is screaming at their screens and getting told to sit down and stop causing trouble. But he didn't sit down. He kept working the family and kept building trust with the young man himself, and he kept waiting for an opening. Around this same time, a family member close to Nicholas, one of the few people in the household who'd started openly voicing his own doubts about the returned son, became someone Parker specifically wanted to interview. But before that interview could happen, he died of a drug overdose. Now, to be clear about what we actually know here, this was a family with a documented long-standing history of addiction. People who were struggling with substances often tragically die of overdoses. So we're not sure that there's anything sinister attached to this death at all, but the timing sits rather uneasily. Right as one of the largest doubters in the house was finally about to be asked questions on the record, he turns up dead. It's not proof of anything, but it's a coincidence stacked right on top of the worst possible moment for it to be one. Parker noticed, and it didn't make him back off. It made him push even harder. By early 1998, the FBI finally agreed to do what should have happened months earlier, to get fingerprints and DNA under court order. Before the lab results even came back, Parker got there first, and the old-fashioned way. He'd built enough trust and enough quiet pressure to just ask directly. The answer, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in how simple it was. "My name is Frederick Bourdin, and I'm wanted by Interpol." DNA and fingerprints confirmed it within weeks. And it's funny how then they're confirming the identity of who he really is instead of kind of confirming that he isn't Nicholas. At this point, now that he's admitted to not being Nicholas, they're like, well, who the heck are you? And they're going to actually confirm that when they never confirmed that he was Nicholas and let him come back to the United States and this family. In September of 1998, Bourdin pleaded guilty to passport fraud and perjury in San Antonio in federal court. The judge sentenced him to 6 years, more than double what the guidelines recommended. And that's because this wasn't just fraud. This was fraud built directly on top of a family's grief about their missing child. And here's where the story stops being about Bourdin and turns into something darker. While in custody, Bourdin made an accusation of his own, and one he's repeated for years since. He argued that the Barkley family must have known he wasn't Nicholas. Look at the evidence, he said. He had the wrong eyes and the wrong accent and the wrong ears, and there was an age gap, a large age gap. Nobody misses that many red flags by accident, he claimed. His claim was someone in that house knew exactly what had happened to the real Nicholas Barclay and chose to accept a stranger rather than let investigators keep digging. And now it needs to be said very clearly that this is only an allegation made by a convicted serial liar with a very obvious motive to shift blame onto the family he'd already victimized once. No court has ever charged a Barkley family member in connection with Nicholas's disappearance. No body has ever been found, and no physical evidence has ever tied any family member to a crime. Some private investigators, including Parker himself, have continued exploring angles on the case over the years, but explored and proven are very different things. What we do know is that Nicholas Barclay has never been found, not even a trace, alive or dead, in 30 years. Some people believe a scared, broken 13-year-old ran away from a court date and never resurfaced, but others point to the documented history of instability in that home and wonder if the truth is even worse. Both remain, to this day, entirely unproven. So which do you believe? That a grieving family was so desperate for closure that basic red flags stopped registering, or that some part of what a proven liar said, however self-serving, however convenient on a witness stand, landed a little too close to something that was true? Bourdin was deported to France after he served his sentence, but he didn't stop. He later tried passing as another missing teenager, a French boy this time, and later still claimed to be a survivor of the 2004 Madrid train bombings. Asked once, years later, whether becoming a husband and father had finally made him a new person, he reportedly gave a short, flat answer of no, this is just who he is. And that might be the most honest sentence he's ever said. Could you imagine being this man's wife? How would you ever believe anything he was ever saying? What keeps people coming back to this case, though, really isn't Bourdin. It's everyone around him. It's the FBI agent who had real doubts but still signed off on the case, a sister who looked his brother's imposter in the face but said, yes, that's my brother, a family member who started asking questions but never got to finish, a private investigator standing alone in a room of federal agents pointing at a photograph of 2 different ears but getting told to just stop, and a 13-year-old boy who called home for a ride, got told to walk, and was never seen again, and whose name became, for almost 5 months, the identity of a stranger from France. The most likely explanation, based on everything actually proven, is that this family was already fractured by addiction and loss and wanted so badly to believe that their nightmare was over that basic, obvious red flags stopped registering as red flags at all. But because Bourdin's claims about that family were never fully tested in court, and because Nicholas Barclay has never been found, the questions don't close that easily. Why did so many people, official and otherwise, explain away what an outside investigator saw immediately? What did the family member who started asking questions actually know before he died? And how much can grief really explain before you have to start asking, was it something else? We may never know exactly what happened to Nicholas Barclay, but maybe the greatest con here wasn't convincing a family that a stranger was their son. Maybe it was convincing everyone else that the family couldn't possibly have known. So what do you think really happened? Let me know in the comments. And until next time, stay safe, stay careful, and remember to double check the ears. Okay, bye guys.